Pelasgians, ancient people, the ancestors of all the Indo-European people. These people were known to illuminate and give the culture to Europe. About them it is known little, or better to say nearly nothing. The alphabet of these mysterious people is called Pelasgic from the civilization that created it. Diodorus Siculus informs to us that the pre-Homeric poets expressed themselves just with that alphabet, and from the same source. Moreover, Diodorus reports that they were the first to bring their alphabet in Italy, as well as to the rest of Europe, practicing opportune adaptations and improvements. Virgil writes, "It is said that the first dwellers of our Italy were the Pelasgians." From the ancient authors we have learned that before the arrival of the Greeks, those territories were known as Pelasgia. The several sources inform to us moreover, then the Greeks learned from the Pelasgians not only the art of the working of the metals, of the construction of walls, but they learned, improving it, their way of writing and made their divinity their own. Pindar tells, bringing a beautiful gift, the earth made the first human being, the divine Pelasgus, be born in Arcadia, long before making the moon. Homer mentions the Pelasgians between allied with the Trojans, and narrates that to kill prayed the Pelasgians' use of Dodona. Homer also mentions them also like people of Crete. Ephorus the historian reports of a book of Hesiod that attests the tradition of people of the Pelasgians in Arcadia and develops the theory that was people of warriors from a native land that annexed and had colonized all the regions of Greece in which the ancient authors talk about, from Dodona to Clay to the fine Triad in Italy, where their very recognizable takeovers are anchor in the time of the Elni and are in tightened relation with the Tonians. The characteristic structure of the masonry of the citadel of Aegean is made of constructions in squared blocks and without the use of mortar wouldn't have had the name of Pelasgian masonry, exactly as sometimes they are said giant walls cyclopic in Italian language, that is constructed from the Pelasgians, those who taught to the Greeks the methods of the constructions, the way to write and their culture. We could continue infinitely with citations of the Pelasgians, in order to always conclude in almost every case and that the civilizations in general terms begin with the Pelasgians, but the main question that rises to this point is, who are they? Nerman Vlorafalesky, in her book Linguistic and Genetic Heredities, written also in English language, has deciphered Pelasgic and Etruscan inscriptions with today's Albanian language. This would try that the Albanians, descendants of the Illyrians, are the modern descendants of the Pelasgians, one of the most ancient civilizations that lived Europe. Here we will propose some translations of Pelasgi. The name Pelasgians was used by classical Greek writers to either refer to populations that were the ancestors or forerunners of the Greeks, or to signify all pre-classical indigenes of Greece. In general, Pelasgian has come to mean more broadly all the indigenous inhabitants of the Aegean Sea region and their cultures, a hold-all term for any ancient, primitive and presumably indigenous people in the Greek world. During the classical period, enclaves under that name survived in several locations of mainland Greece, Crete, and other regions of the Aegean. Populations identified as Pelasgian spoke a language or languages that at the time Greeks identified as barbaric, though some ancient writers nonetheless described the Pelasgians as Greeks. A tradition also survived that large parts of Greece had once been Pelasgian before being Hellenized. The Pelasgians first appear in the poems of Homer. Those who are stated to be Pelasgians in the Iliad are among the allies of Troy. In the section known as the Catalogue of Trojans, they are mentioned between mentions of the Hellespontine cities and the Thracians of southeastern Europe. Homer calls their town or district Larissa and characterizes it as fertile, and its inhabitants as celebrated for their spearsmanship. He records their chiefs as Hippasus and Peleus, sons of Lethus son of Titamus, thus giving all of them names that were Greek or so thoroughly Hellenized that any foreign element has been effaced. In the Odyssey, Odysseus, affecting to be Cretan himself, instances Pelasgians among the tribes in the 90 cities of Crete, language mixing with language side by side. Last on his list, Homer distinguishes them from other ethnicities on the island: Cretans proper, Achaeans, Sidonians, Dorians, and noble Pelasgians. The Iliad also refers to Pelasgic Argos, and to Pelasgic Zeus, living in and ruling over Dodona. Since Greek is classified as an Indo-European language, the major question of concern is whether Pelasgian was an Indo-European language. According to the Iliad, Pelasgians were camping out on the shore together with the following tribes: towards the sea lie the Carians and the Ionians, with curved bows, and the Pelagians and Corcons, and the goodly Pelasgi. Later Greek writers offered little unanimity over which sites and regions were Pelasgian. One of the first was Hesiod. He calls the oracular Dodona, identified by reference to the oak, the seat of Pelasgians, clarifying Homer's Pelasgic Zeus. He mentions also that Pelasgus, Greek, the eponymous ancestor of the Pelasgians, was the father of King Lycaon of Arcadia. The Greek Myths, 1955, is a mythography, a compendium of Greek mythology, with comments and analyses, by the poet and writer Robert Graves, normally published in 2 volumes, though there are abridged editions that present the myths only. Each myth is followed by Graves's interpretation of its origin and significance, following his theories on a prehistoric matriarchal religion as presented in his book White Goddess and elsewhere. These theories and his etymologies are generally rejected by classical scholars, but Graves dismissed such criticism, arguing that by definition classical scholars lack the poetic capacity to forensically examine mythology. Graves interpreted Bronze Age Greece as changing from a matriarchal society under the Pelasgians to a patriarchal one under continual pressure from victorious Greek-speaking tribes. In the second stage, local kings came to each settlement as foreign princes, reigned by marrying the hereditary queen, who represented the triple goddess, and were ritually slain by the next king after a limited period, originally 6 months. Kings managed to evade the sacrifice for longer and longer periods, often by sacrificing substitutes, and eventually converted the queen, priestess of the goddess, into a subservient and chaste wife, and in the final stage had legitimate sons to reign after them. The Greek myths presents the myths as stories from the ritual of all 3 stages, and often as historical records of the otherwise unattested struggles between Greek kings and the moon priestesses. In some cases Graves conjectures a process of iconotropy, or image turning, by which a hypothetical cult image of the matriarchal or matrilineal period has been misread by later Greeks in their own terms. Thus, for example, he conjectures an image of divine twins struggling in the womb of the horse goddess, which later gave rise to the myth of the Trojan horse. Graves's imaginatively reconstructed Pelasgian creation myth features a supreme creatrix, Eurynome, the goddess of all things, who rises naked from chaos to part sea from sky so that she can dance upon the waves. Catching the north wind at her back and rubbing it between her hands, she warms the pneuma and spontaneously generates the serpent Ophon, who mates with her. In the form of a dove upon the waves she lays the cosmic egg and bids Ophon to incubate it by coiling 7 times around until it splits in two and hatches all things that exist. Sun, moon, planets, stars, the earth with its mountains and rivers, its trees, herbs, and living creatures. In the soil of Arcadia the Pelasgians spring up from Ophon's teeth, scattered under the heel of Eurynome, who kicked the serpent from their home on Mount Olympus for his boast of having created all things. Eurynome, whose name means wide wandering, sets male and female titans for each wandering planet. Graves himself was well aware of scholarly mistrust of the Greek myths. In a letter to Ava Gardner, he wrote, "I am not a Greek scholar or an archaeologist or an anthropologist or a comparative mythologist, but I have a good nose and a sense of touch, and think I have connected a lot of mythical patterns which were not connected before. Classical faculties will hate me, and I will get a lot of sniffy reviews." Much like all other aspects of the Pelasgians, their ethnonym, Pelasgoi, is of extremely uncertain provenance and etymology. Michel Sekeleriou collects 15 different etymologies proposed for it by philologists and linguists during the last 200 years, though he admits that most are fanciful. An ancient etymology based on mere similarity of sounds linked Pelasgos to Pelagos, stork, and postulates that the Pelasgians were migrants like storks, possibly from Egypt, where they nest. Aristophanes deals effectively with this etymology in his comedy The Birds. One of the laws of the storks in the satirical Cloud Cuckoo Land, playing upon the Athenian belief that they were originally Pelasgians, is that grown-up storks must support their parents by migrating elsewhere and conducting warfare. Gilbert Murray summarizes the derivation from Pelasg, neighboring land, current at his time. If Pelasgoi is connected with common near, the word would mean neighbor and would denote the nearest strange people to the invading Greeks. Julius Bocorny derives Pelasgoi from Pelagskoi, flatland inhabitants, specifically inhabitants of the Thessalian plain. He details a previous derivation, which appears in English at least as early as William Gladstone's studies on Homer and the Homeric Age. If the Pelasgians were not Indo-Europeans, the name in this derivation must have been assigned by the Hellenes. Ernest Klein argued that the ancient Greek word for sea, Pelagos, and the Doric word plagos, side, which is flat, shared the same root, plak, and that Pelagskoi therefore meant the seamen, where the sea is flat. This could be connected to the maritime marauders referred to as the Sea People in Egyptian records. Subsequent scholarship shows that the connection between the two roots is phonetically impossible. Euripides calls the inhabitants of Argos Pelasgians in his Orestes and the Phoenician women. In a lost play entitled Archelaus, he says that Danaus, on coming to reside in the city of Inachus, Argos, formulated a law whereby the Pelasgians were now to be called Danaans. Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid, describes the Greeks of the Trojan War as Pelasgians in his Metamorphoses. Sadly, his father, Priam, mourned for him, not knowing that young Assacus had assumed wings on his shoulders, and was yet alive. Then also Hector with his brothers made complete but unavailing sacrifice, upon a tomb which bore his carved name. Paris was absent. But soon afterwards, he brought into that land a ravished wife, Helen, the cause of a disastrous war, together with 1,000 ships, and all the great Pelasgian. All stood amazed, but Calchas, who perceived the truth, exclaimed, "Rejoice, Pelasgian men, for we shall conquer, Troy will fall, although the toil of war must long continue, so the 9 birds equal 9 long years of war." And while he prophesied, the serpent, coiled about the tree, was transformed to a stone, curled crooked as a snake. Hecatus of Meltus in a fragment from Genealogy states that the Genos clan, descending from Duke Aeolian, ruled Thessaly, and that it was called Pelasgia from King Pelasgus. A second fragment says that Pelasgus was the son of Zeus and Niobe, and that his son Lycaon founded a dynasty of kings of Arcadia. A fragment from the writings of Acusilus asserts that the Peloponnesians were called Pelasgians after Pelasgus, a son of Zeus and Niobe. Hellanicus of Lesbos, in fragment 7 of the Archaeological, concerns himself with one word in one line of the Iliad, pasture land of horses, applied to Argos in the Peloponnesus. What is said about it is reported by different authors, and all accounts differ. The explanation is trivial and mythical, but all accounts agree Hellanicus said the term Arga or Argolis once applied to all Peloponnesus, and that Pelasgus and his 2 brothers received it as an inheritance from their father, named either Triopas, Aster or Pharonous. Pelasgus built the citadel Larissa of Argos on the Erasinus river, whence the name Pelasgic Argos, of the Peloponnesus, but later resettled inland, built Paesia and named the region, or caused it to be named Pelasgia, to be renamed Arcadia with the coming of the Greeks. According to fragment 76 of Hellanicus's Pharones, from Pelasgus and his wife Menip came a line of kings, Phaster, Amynta, Titamids and Nassas, kings of Pelasgiatis in Thessaly. The Pelasgians under Nassas rose up, and Stasan, against the Hellenes, who presumably had acquired Thessaly, and departed for Italy, where they first took Cortona and then founded Tyrrhenia. The conclusion is that Hellanicus believed the Pelasgians of Thessaly, and indirectly of Peloponnesus, to have been the ancestors of the Etruscans. In the histories, the Greek historian Herodotus of Halicarnassus wrote, with uncertainty, about the language of the Pelasgians. I am unable to state with certainty what language the Pelasgians spoke, but we could consider the speech of the Pelasgians who still exist in settlements above Tyrrhenia in the city of Criston, formerly neighbors to the Dorians who at that time lived in the land now called Thessaliotis, also the Pelasgians who once lived with the Athenians and then settled Placia and Scylac in the Hellespont, and along with those who lived with all the other communities and were once Pelasgian but changed their names. If one can judge by this evidence, the Pelasgians spoke a barbarian language. And so, if the Pelasgian language was spoken in all these places, the people of Attica, being originally Pelasgian, must have learned a new language when they became Hellenes. As a matter of fact, the people of Cristonia and Placia no longer speak the same language, which shows that they continue to use the dialect they brought with them when they migrated to those lands. Herodotus alludes to other districts where Pelasgian peoples lived on under changed names, Samothrace and the Pelasgian city of Antandros in the Troad probably provide instances of this. He mentions that there were Pelasgian populations on the islands of Lemnos and Imbros. Those of Lemnos he represents as being of Hellespontine Pelasgians who had been living in Athens but whom the Athenians resettled on Lemnos and then found it necessary to reconquer. This expulsion of non-Athenian Pelasgians from Athens may reflect, according to the historian Robert Buck, a dim memory of forwarding of refugees, closely akin to the Athenians in speech and custom, to the Ionian colonies. Herodotus also mentions the Cabiri, the gods of the Pelasgians, whose worship gives an idea of where the Pelasgians once were. Another claim made by Herodotus entails the Hellenes, associated with the Dorians, having separated from the Pelasgians, with the former surpassing the latter numerically. As for the Hellenes, it seems obvious to me that ever since they came into existence they have always used the same language. They were weak at first, when they were separated from the Pelasgians, but they grew from a small group into a multitude, especially when many peoples, including other barbarians in great numbers, had joined them. Moreover, I do not think the Pelasgian, who remained barbarians, ever grew appreciably in number or power. He states that the Pelasgians of Athens were called Crani and that the Pelasgian population among the Ionians of the Peloponnesus were the Aegean Pelasgians. Moreover, Herodotus mentions that the Aeolians, according to the Hellenes, were known anciently as Pelasgians. In the history of the Peloponnesian War, the Greek historian Thucydides wrote about the Pelasgians, stating that, before the time of Hellen, son of Deucalion, the country went by the names of the different tribes, in particular of the Pelasgian. It was not till Hellen and his sons grew strong in Theatis, and were invited as allies into the other cities, that one by one they gradually acquired from the connection the name of Hellenes, though a long time elapsed before that name could fasten itself upon all. He regards the Athenians as having lived in scattered independent settlements in Attica, but at some time after Theseus they changed residence to Athens, which was already populated. A plot of land below the Acropolis was called Pelasgian and was regarded as cursed, but the Athenians settled there anyway. In connection with the campaign against Amphipolis, Thucydides mentions that several settlements on the promontory of Act were home to mixed barbarian races speaking the two languages. There is also a small Chalcidian element, but the great number are Tino-Pelasgians once settled in Lemnos and Athens, and Bisaltans, Crestonians and Ionians, the towns all being small ones. The historian Forefathers, building on a fragment from Hesiod that attests to a tradition of an aboriginal Pelasgian people in Arcadia, developed a theory of the Pelasgians as a people living a military way of life, Stratiatikon Bion, and that, in converting many peoples to the same mode of life, they imparted their name to all, meaning all of Hellas. They colonized Crete and extended their rule over Epirus, Thessaly, and by implication over wherever else the ancient authors said they were, beginning with Homer. The Peloponnese was called Pelasgia. In the Roman antiquities, Dionysius of Halicarnassus in several pages gives a synoptic interpretation of the Pelasgians based on the sources available to him then, concluding that Pelasgians were Greek. Afterwards, some of the Pelasgians who inhabited Thessaly, as it is now called, being obliged to leave their country, settled among the Aborigines and jointly with them made war upon the Sicels. It is possible that the Aborigines received them partly in the hope of gaining their assistance, but I believe it was chiefly on account of their kinship, for the Pelasgians, too, were a Greek nation originally from the Peloponnesus. He goes on to add that the nation wandered a great deal. They were originally natives of Aegean Argos, descended from Pelasgus, the son of Zeus and Niobe. They migrated from there to Haemonia, later called Thessaly, where they drove out the barbarian inhabitants and divided the country into Theatis, Achaea, and Pelasgiatis, named after Aegeus, Theus and Pelasgus, the sons of Larissa and Poseidon. Subsequently, about the 6th generation, they were driven out by the Geats and Pelagians, who are now called Aetolians and Locrians. From there, the Pelasgians dispersed to Crete, the Cyclades, Histiotis, Boeotia, Phasis, Euboea, the coast along the Hellespont and the islands, especially Lesbos, which had been colonized by Macar son of Cryonicus. Most went to Dodona and eventually being driven from there to Italy, then called Saturnia. They landed at Spina at the mouth of the Po River. Still others crossed the Apennine Mountains to Umbria and being driven from there went to the country of the Aborigines. These consented to a treaty and settled them at Velia. They and the Aborigines took over Umbria but were dispossessed by the Tyrians. The author continues to detail the tribulations of the Pelasgians and then goes on to the Tyrians, whom he is careful to distinguish from the Pelasgians. In his description of Greece, Pausanias mentions the Arcadians, who state that Pelasgus, along with his followers, was the first inhabitant of their land. Upon becoming king, Pelasgus was responsible for inventing huts, sheepskin coats, and a diet consisting of acorns. Moreover, the land he ruled was named Pelasgia. When Arcas became king, Pelasgia was renamed Arcadia and its inhabitants, the Pelasgians, were renamed Arcadians. Pausanias also mentions the Pelasgians as responsible for creating a wooden image of Orpheus in a sanctuary of Demeter at Thrace, as well as expelling the Ionians and Lacedaemonians from Lemnos. Strabo dedicates a section of his geography to the Pelasgians, relating both his own opinions and those of prior writers. Of his own opinions he says, "As for the Pelasgi, almost all agree, in the first place, that some ancient tribe of that name spread throughout the whole of Greece, and particularly among the Aeolians of Thessaly." He defines Pelasgian Argos as being between the outlets of the Peneus River and Thermopylae as far as the mountainous country of Pindus, and states that it took its name from Pelasgian rule. He includes also the tribes of Epirus as Pelasgians, based on the opinions of many. Lesbos is named Pelasgian. Chaea was settled by Pelasgians from Thessaly, who called it by its former name, Aegiala. Pelasgians also settled around the mouth of the Tiber River in Italy at Pygi and a few other settlements under a king, Maluos. Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton, an English writer and intellectual, argued that the Pelasgians spoke Greek based on the fact that areas traditionally inhabited by the Pelasgi, that is Arcadia and Attica, only spoke Greek, and the few surviving Pelasgian words and inscriptions, that is, Lamina Borgiana, Herodotus 2.52.1, betray Greek linguistic features despite the classical identification of Pelasgian as a barbaric language. According to Dr. Thomas Harrison of St. Andrews University, the Greek etymology of Pelasgian terms mentioned in Herodotus, such as derived from, indicates that the Pelasgians spoke a language at least akin to Greek. In western Anatolia, many toponyms with the ss infix derive from the adjectival suffix also seen in cuneiform Luwian and Sumpelic. The classic example is Bronze Age Tarhuntissa, loosely, city of the storm god Tarhunta, and later Parnassus may be related to the Hittite word parna or house. These elements have led to a second theory, that Pelasgian was to some degree an Anatolian language, or that it had aerial influences from Anatolian languages. Vladimir Georgiev, a Bulgarian linguist, asserted that the Pelasgians were Indo-Europeans, with an Indo-European etymology of Pelasgoi from Pelagos, as the sea people, the Prst of Egyptian inscriptions, and related them to the neighboring Thracians. He proposed a sound shift model from Indo-European to Pelasgian. Origins of the Albanians and obsolete theories, and Albanian nationalism. In 1854, an Austrian diplomat and Albanian language specialist, Johann Georg von Hahn, identified the Pelasgian language with Ur-Albanian. This theory has been rejected by modern scholars. Albert Joris van Windekens, 1915-1989, offered rules for an unattested hypothetical Indo-European Pelasgian language, selecting vocabulary for which there was no Greek etymology among the names of places, heroes, animals, plants, garments, artifacts, social organization. His 1952 essay Le Pelasgique was critically received. Dorian invasion and Kretschmer's external Greeks. One theory utilizes the name Pelasgian to describe the inhabitants of the lands around the Aegean Sea before the arrival of Proto-Greek speakers, as well as traditionally identified enclaves of descendants that still existed in classical Greece. The theory derives from the original concepts of the philologist Paul Kretschmer, whose views prevailed throughout the first half of the 20th century and are still given some credibility today. The poet and mythologist Robert Graves asserts that certain elements of that mythology originate with the native Pelasgian people, namely the parts related to his concept of the white goddess, an archetypical earth goddess, drawing additional support for his conclusion from his interpretations of other ancient literature, Irish, Welsh, Greek, Biblical, Gnostic, and medieval writings. Some Georgian scholars, including R.V. Gordiziani and M.G. Abdushlishvili, connect the Pelasgians with the Ibero-Caucasian peoples of the prehistoric Caucasus, known to the Greeks as Colchians and Iberians. During the early 20th century, archaeological excavations conducted by the Italian Archaeological School and by the American Classical School on the Athenian Acropolis and on other sites within Attica revealed Neolithic dwellings, tools, pottery and skeletons from domesticated animals, that is, sheep, fish. All of these discoveries showed significant resemblances to the Neolithic discoveries made on the Thessalian acropolises of Sesklo and Dimony. These discoveries help provide physical confirmation of the literary tradition that describes the Athenians as the descendants of the Pelasgians, who appear to descend continuously from the Neolithic inhabitants in Thessaly. Overall, the archaeological evidence indicates that the site of the Acropolis was inhabited by farmers as early as the 6th millennium BC. It should be noted, however, that contrary to what Procopiou suggests about the results of the American excavations near the clepsydra, Sarah in her definitive publication of the prehistoric material unequivocally states that no Dimony-type pottery was unearthed. In August and September 1926, members of the Italian School of Archaeology conducted trial excavations on the island of Lemnos. A short account of their excavations appeared in the Messenger d'Athens for 3 January 1927. The overall purpose of the excavations was to shed light on the island's Etrusco-Pelasgian civilization. The excavations were conducted on the site of the city of Hephaestus, that is, Palaeopolis, where the Pelasgians, according to Herodotus, surrendered to Miltiades of Athens. There, a Tyrrhenian necropolis was discovered revealing bronze objects, pots, and more than 130 ossuaries. The ossuaries contained distinctly male and female funeral ornaments. Male ossuaries contained knives and axes, whereas female ossuaries contained earrings, bronze pins, necklaces, gold diadems, and bracelets. The decorations on some of the gold objects contained spirals of Mycenaean origin, but had no geometric forms. According to their ornamentation, the pots discovered at the site were from the geometric period. However, the pots also preserved spirals indicative of Mycenaean art. The results of the excavations indicate that the Tyrrhenians or Pelasgians of Lemnos were a remnant of a Mycenaean population. During the 1980s, the Skata Plain project identified Middle Helladic and Late Helladic sites on mountain summits near the plains of Skata in Boeotia. These fortified mountain settlements were, according to tradition, inhabited by Pelasgians up until the end of the Bronze Age. Moreover, the location of the sites is an indication that the Pelasgian inhabitants sought to distinguish themselves ethnically and economically from the Mycenaean Greeks who controlled the Skata Plain.